Alright, this is my week 3 assignment. So to start off, excuse me. So overall, the two forms of servitude in 18th century British America appear to be differentiated by their length of service, legal status, and racial discrimination. Servants, typically poor Europeans, entered into contracts for a fixed term, so it was like around 4 to 7 years that I learned, and in exchange for passage to America, they had some legal protection and could eventually gain freedom, land, and rights. Conversely, enslaved individuals, mostly African or Native American, were bound for life, and their children were inherited the same status. In the case for servants, Robert Beverly explains that the legal protections they enjoyed, all servants whatsoever have their complaints heard without fee or reward, but if the master be found faulty, the charge of the complaint is cast upon him. This suggests that while they faced hard labor, there were legal mechanisms, in place to protect their rights. So on the other hand, slavery was more about absolute and permanent. As John Norris puts it, enslaved individuals that were brought to employ them in any sort of labor, and their masters or owners have them as good as right and title them during their lives as a man has here to a horse or ox. Slaves had no prospects of freedom, and their labor was used for the lifetime of the individual and passed down to their descendants. Thus, the two systems starkly contrast in terms of legal freedom, the potential for autonomy, and the perpetuation of servitude through generations, with slavery being more severe and inescapable. So in each of the selections, the men offer distinct perspectives on servitude, shaped by their roles and attendant audiences. So Robert Beverly, a planter, addresses an audience that may be concerned about the treatment of servants and slaves in Virginia. His perspective kind of aims to justify the legal distinctions between indentured and servitude and slavery. It emphasizes the legal protections for servants. He reassures his audience by saying that all servants whatsoever have their complaints heard without fee or reward, but if the master be found guilty, the charge of the complaint is cast upon him. Beverly seeks to mitigate concerns about cruelty by highlighting the protections in place for servants. But on the other hand, John Norris, a South Carolina planter, writes to an English audience, particularly poor Englishmen, encouraging them to immigrate and work in the colonies. His goals is to promote the ideas of servitude as a temporary, less severe form of labor. He contrasts it with slavery, noting that enslaved individuals, unlike indentured servants, are bound for life. Quote, their masters or owners have then as good a right and title to them during their lives as a man has here to a horse or ox, like I stated before. And it downplays the severity of servitude in the colonies, particularly for servants, and assures the audience that the conditions aren't as harsh as they might mitigate. So I have some patterns that I saw where both Beverly and Norris present servitude in a way that seeks to defend or justify the system, either by emphasizing legal protections or servants for downplaying the harshness of the labor. They also address the concerns of their audiences. Beverly defends the system to those within the colonies, while Norris works to convince potential migrants that servitude is a manageable, even beneficial experience, and both of them use legal language or comparisons to familiar concepts, such as the comparison to animals in Norris's quote, and it makes the servitude seem more palatable to their respective audiences. From the perspective of the indentured servant, we gain a first-hand account of the harsh realities of servitude, revealing the deep emotional and physical toll of living under such conditions. These servants often had little control over their lives, while many enduring grueling labor in exchange for the promise of freedom after completing their terms of service. However, their freedom was often uncertain, with many experiencing additional years of hardship due to the oppressive nature of the system. The inter-servant's account paints a picture of personal sacrifice and loss of autonomy, offering a stark contrast to the experiences described by the elite white man. The servants had to deal with the fear and reality of being worked to the point of exhaustion, and they were often left with little more than the bare minimum after their contracts expired. So their narratives highlight the true toll of servitude that those in positions of power like Robert Beverly and John Norris either downplayed or ignored. So on the other hand, the elite white men provide a more rationalized and detached view of servitude, emphasizing the legal protections and economic opportunities offered by both forms of labor. They focus on advantages for poor European immigrants, suggesting that servitude could be a means for upward mobility, such as land ownership or personal freedom, by framing it as an opportunity for a better life. So in their writings, such as Beverly's defense of Virginia's legal protections for the servants, they aim to present the system as beneficial, not cruel. Their portrayal of this is often heavily sanitized to appeal to potential settlers and investors, promoting the system as a manageable and even desirable arrangement for those willing to work hard. However, their perspective conveniently overlooks the exploitive and dehumanizing aspects of the system, such as lack of agency and physical toll that servants endured. For the elite men, the focus is on the economic benefits, both for the colony and themselves, rather than the lived experience of the people working under these systems. So the argument for having more servants and fewer slaves and vice versa centered around economic efficiency, social structure, and labor costs, though each side presents its own reasoning. So first, servants, particularly European servants, were seen as a cost-effective option for early colonists. They were often contracted for a set period, the defined terms of service. The elite believed that this system allowed for more manageable labor costs, as they didn't have to provide lifetime maintenance for the servant after the term ended. And John Norris put that in his words, that the labor is not in reality as hard as it generally is in England. And they also allowed for a form of social mobility, as servants could earn their freedom after completing their contracts. Once free, they were granted land and had the potential to rise in status, which was an attractive prospect for the poor Englishmen and women seeking for better life in the colonies. Norris described it as may have land assigned him by the Lord from the Lord's proprietors, which would enable them to work independently and prosper. Servants were also protected by law, including the right to have their complaints heard in court. However, for slaves, especially African Americans, they represented a permanent, lifelong force of labor, unlike those who worked for a limited period of time. Slaves were bound for life, with the children inheriting the same status. He explains that there is necessity for these slaves because very few servants are there to be procured to perform the business of the country. While slaves were initially expensive to acquire, they were ultimately a better investment over time, as they did not require new contracts and their labor would continue for life. As the Carolina planter states, with good management, a slave could pay for his first costs in about 4 years at most, besides this maintenance, providing long-term economic benefit for the slave owner. So slaves are viewed as more dependable and controllable in the long run as well, since their status was unchangeable. So moving on to the next primary source, enslaved people had complex relationships with their forced labor upon marked by resentment, resistance, and survival. Many resented work, finding ways to resist, such as working slowly or feigning illness. Though these actions were met with harsh punishments for some labor, that just meant survival, something they endured because it was all they knew. Despite the hardships, the enslaved individuals formed a strong bonds with each other, usually shared labor to often support and find strength, while many eventually accepted their work as part of their daily life. Often others dreamed of freedom and escape, which helped them maintain hope. And however, their work was often dehumanizing, little regard for their well-being, reducing them to property. Still, some found dignity in skilled labor like carpentry or sewing, taking pride in their craftsmanship even during all of that. Enslaved people had complex relationships. Enslaved people, most of whom expected to die in bondage, found ways to construct a sense of dignity, and identity and accomplishment through their work, despite the dehumanizing conditions. While the labor was oppressive, they found strength from acts of resistance, community, and personal pride in their skills. Work became a means of survival, but it also provided opportunities for enslaved individuals to assert some control over their lives. They built strong communal bonds, supporting each other through shared labor and often emotional resilience through song, storytelling, and mutual care. Many took pride in their craftsmanship, especially those who worked in skilled trades. These individuals often developed a deep sense of personal achievement in their craft, and even when forced to labor under the threat of punishment. Though the labor was exploited, enslaved people were able to find moments of dignity and pride in their work, which helps to shape their identity in an environment that constantly sought to strip them of it. Additionally, dreams of freedom and visions of a better life beyond slavery fueled a sense of self-worth, providing hope that they would one day escape or pass on a true legacy of strength and resilience to future generations. So enslaved people found ways to exercise initiative, creativity, and sense of possession over their labor despite being oppressed by the system of slavery. So here are several key ways they did this. Enslaved individuals would often deliberately work slow, as mentioned, or they would sabotage tools or crops or machinery when possible to undermine the system that exploited them. They would use music, storytelling, dance, or craftsmanship as forms of self-expression and cultural preservation. Many enslaved people would exercise initiative through craftsmanship, as I already mentioned, and took pride in it. They also exercised initiative by forming tight-knit communities where they could share resources, knowledge, and strategies to survive and resist. They also were able to negotiate their work conditions with their slave owners sometimes, offering to take on specific tasks as more favorable assignments in exchange for certain privileges such as extra food or time to themselves. Enslaved people worked to create and protect family ties, which were often threatened by sale or separation. Through these relationships, they exerted control over their emotional and social lives, asserting ownership over the sense of belonging and identity. So, enslaved people often faced the complex and painful task of reconciling feelings of affection or attachment to individual slaveholders with deep contempt for the institution of slavery itself. The enslaved people sometimes formed personal bonds with their slave owners or members of the family, especially if they were treated with relative kindness. These relationships could often include feelings of affection or gratitude for moments of personal care or compassion. However, they could also simultaneously hold contempt for the larger system of slavery that dehumanized them and subjected to forced labor and brutality. For some, affection for their owners or certain overseers was a coping mechanism, and they fostered positive relationships for those in power. They hoped to receive better treatment or privileges, such as less physical punishment or more autonomy. This could also coexist with a strong resentment for the institution that still kept them enslaved. Some people spoke good of their masters who showed kindness or offered better conditions compared to others. While they may have felt affection toward these individuals, they still understood that slavery as a whole was bad. And in some cases, affection did not prelude resistance. Enslaved people sometimes expressed affection for the individual slaveholder, but were clear in their contempt for the system of slavery. For instance, they might have felt a certain fondness for an owner who allowed them some personal freedoms, but still yearned for complete freedom for themselves. And in some cases, enslaved people hoped that their personal relationship with an owner would eventually lead to freedom, especially if the owner was seen as more sympathetic than others. This hope could also coexist with a sharp awareness that there is a large injustice in the institution. Enslaved people might hold affection for an owner who they believed might one day grant them freedom, while still harboring a profound hatred for the system that kept them enslaved in the first place. Overall, an enslaved person navigated the tension between affection and contempt with a complex understanding of their roles individuals played within the broader brutal system of slavery. These emotions, recognitions, were often survival strategies of those to maintain sense of humanity in an otherwise dehumanizing system.